Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History Vibe podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Robert Miller, and today we're going to be discussing his book titled Born Divine, The Births of Jesus and Other Sons of God. So welcome back to the show, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's get started. And before I get to the questions, the links to purchase this book to multiple websites will be in the description below. So you say that Jesus is born divine in the book, but he's not the only Son of God, as the title makes clear. There are other sons of God. And I've seen other scholars talk about this before, like Margaret Barker. And she goes into Jesus being identified with the Old Testament God by several New Testament texts. Because in her view, she says Jesus and Lord are used to refer to the same character in the New Testament. But Lord is never identified as God. Lord is Jesus. And others will point out that, well, Jesus is a son of God. And there are other sons of God in Judaism, especially back then when Judaism was polytheistic, before they became monotheistic.
Yeah.
So what do you think about all of that?
Well, the whole term Lord is pretty spongy as it is because it has more than one meaning, right? It can refer to an earthly master, like a slave owner was called a lord, a kurios. It was also the term referred to used to refer to God. I mean, there are still people in England whom you are supposed to address today as my Lord, not because they're divine, but because that's a social status climber, or a social status indicator, which was fully functional in the ancient world. So it depends entirely on context, on what that word means within a given usage. I'm focused on the whole thing about sonship and Jesus as a son of God. And as you point out, and as my book title indicates, there's lots of people who carried that name around in the ancient world. The early Christian, shall we say, intuition or interpretation of Jesus as Son of God, that took place in two quite distinct cultural contexts. And keeping those distinctions clear in our minds is important to understand the diversity of the ways in which the term is used. In the Jewish world, it had a specific kind of meaning, and in the non-Jewish world, or as we used to say, the pagan world, the Greek and Roman world, it meant something related, but actually quite different. In the Jewish world, for a human to be called a son of God had nothing to do with the way that person was born. It had to do with that man's relationship with God. That man would relate to God as a son relates to a father. It's got nothing to do with genetics. It's got to do with obedience and submission. There are places in the Hebrew Bible where humans addressed other humans who are not their physical fathers as father. For example, the prophet Elijah had a disciple, Elisha, who's not his biological son, and yet Elisha calls Elijah my father. There's a time when the king of Israel was looking to cut a deal with the Babylonian Empire and make a deal to become a vassal. And part of the formal terms of that proposal was the king sent a message to the emperor of Babylon and said, I will be your son and you will be my father. In other words, I'll be completely at your disposal, the way a son would be to his father. So I've collected a few examples of these. We can see today, these are selected from examples that are discussed in my book. So 3 of the ways in which the term Son of God is actually used in the Hebrew Bible is it can refer to supernatural beings who hang out with Yahweh up in the heaven. We might call these angels today. That term didn't exist quite that way then, but they're called sons of God. One of the places you can see that is in Genesis just before the great flood, is told, it says that the sons of God looked down on the earth and saw the daughters of men, and they became erotically involved with them, etc. It's kind of a strange and rather terrifying story. There's other places, say in the book of Job, where various sons of God are up in the heavens meeting with God to discuss affairs. And one of those sons is called in Hebrew Ha-Satan, the Satan, the adversary. So that's one of the ways in which the word was used. There's a number of places that report Yahweh calling Israel his son. And here's one particularly clear example of that. It comes from the book of Exodus, in which Yahweh tells Moses to go tell Pharaoh, these are the words of Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son. I have told you to let my son go so that he may worship me. You have refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. So it can be applied to the entire nation of Israel, which is by its covenant supposed to have this relationship of obedience to God. There's a number of places as well in the Old Testament in which the king who descends from David is referred to as God's son. One of them is the promise that Yahweh relates to King David by way of the prophet Nathan. He says, after you, David, die, then I will form a relationship with your son, Solomon. It says, I will be his father, and he shall be my son. Not that he is my son now, but he will become that. In other words, he will acquire this relationship as the rightful king of Israel, in which he is supposed to display a relationship of obedience. I could cite other examples, but I think if you want to find those, you can see them in my book. But these are, I think, pretty clear examples of ways in which the Jewish scriptures use this term. There's a fourth way that's actually pretty interesting. So if you, on that slide, you can see that anybody, any individual who is righteous, and by righteous, it's meant that anyone who fulfills the commandments of God, anyone who lives according to God's will to righteousness, can be called a son of God. And here's an example from the book of Sirach, which is not included in the Hebrew Bible, but it is a Jewish writing from that time. And he says, be a father to orphans and be like a husband to their mother, and then the Most High will call you his son, and his love for you will be greater than a mother's. And what's interesting about this verse here is that in Luke's gospel, Jesus is portrayed as using exactly that same terminology. It says, love your enemies and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. So it's clear that in the Jewish world, right, Son of God was an indicator of relationship with God. So that in calling Jesus Son of God, the original impulse was to, the original intent, I suppose, was to emphasize that Jesus related to God as an obedient Israelite, as someone whose relationship with God was so proper, was so correct, that he was righteous. This was, of course, intended as a way of refuting the inference people could draw from the fact that Jesus had been executed, in which it would appear that he had been cursed by God by calling him Son of God. His first followers were trying to rebut that accusation. Part of it has to do also with the way in which the Israelite religion and Judaism understood God's role in producing human babies. So let's have a look at some very interesting quotations on our next slide. And there's many like this, but here are two. And this is from the book of Genesis, the very first birth, that Adam had intercourse with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, saying, I have made a man with the help of Yahweh. Not with the help of Adam, but with the help of Yahweh. So even what we would think of as natural conceptions were understood as a blessing from God and made possible because of God's benevolence and at times God's intervention. The whole idea of scientific laws did not exist in the ancient world. People didn't think of the natural world and the supernatural world as distinct spheres. They considered rain that came on time, a good harvest, being healed from a disease to be manifestations of divine action. And in this case, the joy of conceiving was also understood to be with God's help. Another example here is from the book of Ruth. Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, he had intercourse with her, and Yahweh made her conceive and gave birth to a son. So they were well aware that not everyone could conceive, so that when it happened, it had to be a divine blessing, and not every pregnancy came to term. And so that also was seen as a blessing. And there's also indications or in later stories in which God makes possible a conception when people are infertile. The most famous example, of course, is with Abraham and Sarah. So that the sons there, Jacob was born, Isaac and Jacob actually were born after the time when it was thought to be impossible, and yet God intervened. It does not do away with normal human sexual activity, but is understood to be a way in which God uses what we would call the natural workings of the world to advance God's purpose. This idea of God begetting sons, begetting children, could be understood in a spiritual sense too, and we can see that in the New Testament. So on our next slide, we have some examples of that. And these come from John's Gospel and the first letter of John, most likely written by the same person. To those who believed in the light, it gave the right to become children of God. They were born not from sexual union, not from physical desire, and not from male willfulness. They were begotten by God. Now, it's very clear, right, that we're not talking here about miraculous births. We're not talking here about births that take place apart from normal human sexual conceiving. And yet, the affirmation is very clear. They were not born from sexual union, right? Because this status of being begotten by God is not understood to be something which is physical. It's understood to be something which is a spiritual endowment. And you see this two examples of that follow up quite readily. Everyone who does justice is begotten by God. Love is from God, and everyone who loves was begotten by God. So the claim that Jesus was a son of God or begotten by God originally did not put him in any kind of special or unique status. It included Jesus with the kinds of people that God had favored. Let's look at the next one, because here we see an interesting way in which Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, reflects on the story of Abraham and Sarah. And it's really interesting the way Paul describes this. He said Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And Paul simply here rehearses the story in Genesis that the first son that Abraham had was not with his wife Sarah, but through his slave woman Hagar. And the second wife was with Sarah. His second son was with Sarah, his wife. So he said he had two sons, one by a slave woman, the other by a free woman. Now look how he distinguishes them in the language of begetting in the next sentence. One, the child of a slave begotten through the flesh. The other, the child of a free woman, begotten through God's promise. In both cases, of course, the Bible tells us Abraham had intercourse with these women. And so their physical manner of conception was identical. And yet Paul insists, right, that the first one was a flesh begetting and the second was a blessing from God. That's even more direct a few verses later in Galatians, where he says, the child who was begotten through flesh persecuted the child begotten through the Spirit. And that language, begotten through the Spirit, is identical to the language that the Gospels use for speaking of the birth of Jesus. And so this should be a warning here that this language has more than one meaning, and to see it as applying uniquely to Jesus requires some very special consideration of context, because the term is able to be used in ways which don't assume that. Okay, to finish out like this very quick overview, let's have a look at a different context here, a Jewish context, and then the Greco-Roman context, and what it meant to call Jesus Son of God. In each of these, in the Jewish context, we've seen that this is not a unique title. There are other people who are referred to as Son of God in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. And in each case, the person so referred to, like David or Solomon or the nation of Israel or anyone who does justice, is not divine. It's not meant to indicate divine status, but as I said, it indicates a relationship with God. In the Greco-Roman context, it means something quite different. Of course, it is not a unique title. There are many, not many, but a good number of men who are understood or believed to be God's son in the Greek and Roman cultures. And they are understood to be God's son in a very literal way, that the stories about their birth include a god, Zeus or some other god, coming down in physical form and having literal sexual intercourse with a human woman. And hence the boy who's born is semi-divine, part human, part divine. And so Son of God in the Greco-Roman context is not a label of relationship with God. It's meant to indicate something about the nature of that person, the physical, spiritual nature of that person, that ontologically that person is genetically half human and genetically half divine. So we need to just be aware of the different contexts in which these terms are being used to properly understand how they might be applied to Jesus. So I think that's, well, let's look here at how the ancient world understood this. And I picked this quotation here by Arian, who is a historian who tells the great story of Alexander's conquest of Persia and beyond. It's a remarkable story. And in speaking about Alexander, he says this, it seems to me that a man who was different from all other human beings could not have come into being apart from divinity. This is a very helpful thing to see spelled out like this, because it tells us the way that the ancient Greek and Roman mind thought about men. They're always men, of course, this being a very patriarchal culture, that men who had achieved enormous accomplishments that other human beings could only dream of. And someone who had these very, very outsized, magnificent, or shall we say, glorious or just huge kind of accomplishments were somehow not really only human. There must be something divine about them. This is not a hard intuition, I think, to understand. I have watching basketball games, right? You see some of these NBA players like float in the air, seemingly just to defy gravity and dunk a basket. And, I can't do that. I don't know how any human being can do it. I'm watching a human being do it, and I don't believe that that person had a divine father, but you understand what I'm trying to say, right? That there's something just superhuman about those kinds of talents. And so in the ancient world, this was understood to be quite literal. So many men who were understood to be people of enormous accomplishments, you'll find their biographies begin with a story about a god coming down, having intercourse with a human, and then the child born is born divine, is half human and half divine. And just here's an example on the next slide of the range of people who could be characterized that way. One is a man named Theogenes. Most of us haven't heard of him because he was an athlete. And the story is he won over 400 gold medals at the Olympics. That's probably exaggerated, but he was famous for nothing else except his being this Olympics superstar. And so, sure enough, when his short story about his life is told, it begins with a story of him being physically fathered by a god. And so we have this same kind of story repeated by serious historians, right? About Alexander, the great conqueror, about Augustus Caesar, the emperor, about Plato, who was not an athlete, who was not a conqueror, was not a statesman, simply was a philosopher. And people said that his philosophy was so profound and so spiritually uplifting that he must have been divine. The same thing is said about the mysterious figure of Pythagoras, an ancient philosopher. And a very interesting philosopher, Apollonius of Tyana, has a very elaborate biography, which in many ways is eerily similar to the gospel stories of Jesus. He was a philosopher who also was able to work miracles of healing. So this is a pretty good sample of the spectrum of accomplishments that the ancient world would see fit to attribute to a kind of superhuman nature that humans displayed. And so it would be, again, culturally appropriate for followers of Jesus who had grown up in the Greek and Roman culture to say something like this, or to think Jesus's life and his teaching and his significance for human history is so incredible. He must have had God for a father. And that's the sort of logic by which this title could have caught on in the ancient world. It's a very different way of understanding divine sonship than in the Jewish tradition, but these two blend, of course, in early Christianity. So that's been a rather long-winded answer to your question, Jacob.
Oh no, I thought it was perfect. So basically, what you're saying is that it appears to you that the early followers of Jesus thought that he was such an amazing and accomplished man that they thought, oh, he must be the Son of God. But how do you think they wrestled with the fact that in Judaism, God really can't have a son like Jesus? He didn't. Now, granted, in Judaism, they're sons of God, but they're not literally sons of God.
Yeah, that's a very important thing to keep in mind, and it's what, when I wrote the book, I really had to rethink this issue, because when we get to Luke's gospel, now Luke is a fully Hellenistic Greek author. He comes from that world. He doesn't believe in the Greek and Roman gods, but he thinks that way. And so for him, it is utterly appropriate that Jesus would have God as kind of a literal father. It's really interesting to watch how he handles that because he's very delicate with it. There's no story of God like physically consorting with Mary or anything like that. He simply says that God's power sort of overshadows her. It's almost as a semi erotic, semi sexual image. And so Luke is very clear that Jesus does not have a human father and that somehow God has impregnated his Jesus's mother, although there's no physical contact. So he's able to sort of finesse it that way. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew lives in the Jewish world. I mean, he can write in Greek, as many Jews could, but he thinks from head to toe like a Jewish person. And for him, the thought of God having any kind of physical role in the conception would have just been blasphemous. And that's what led me to suspect that maybe Matthew doesn't believe that Jesus was conceived without a human father. It's a bit tricky. I lay out this case at great length in my book, but my position is that that Matthew assumes that Jesus has a human father, but that Joseph is not that man. I have to admit that this is not a position taken by many. In fact, probably I can count. I have more fingers, here than scholars who agree with that. But I published this in 2003. That's 20 years ago. I presented this at various scholarly forums, and no one has, to my mind, refuted it, which doesn't mean it's true. It might mean they just ignored it. But I'd like to think that it's gaining acceptance. This raises tricky questions, but it explains perfectly the story in which Joseph is troubled by his wife, to whom he is married. After betrothal, couples were considered to be married. They were allowed to have sex. Their marriage wasn't complete until the woman moved in with him. There's a two-step stage process in Judaism for a legal marriage. Joseph knows that he was not the biological father of the child his wife is carrying, and he's in a moral dilemma, right? According to Torah, he's not allowed to marry a woman who's already pregnant. So the question for him, right, is either she was pregnant when I married her, in which case we have to dissolve the marriage, or she's become pregnant since I married her, in which case, the horror of exposing a young girl, probably was 13 or 14 years old, to a legal process, which could well result in very dire consequences. So Joseph is portrayed as someone with a very strong conscience and empathy. And the angel tells him to do two things in his dream. He says, don't hesitate to take her as your wife. Finish the process. Take her into your home and complete the marriage. And then name the boy Jesus. This is very significant, and most people won't catch it because we're not familiar with Jewish paternal customs. But in the public ceremony of a father bestowing a name on a child, it's his way of acknowledging paternity. So that in Matthew's mind, even though Jesus is not biologically Joseph's son, he is legally, that Joseph has in effect legally adopted Jesus into his family and is entitled to his inheritance, which means he's entitled to inherit also Joseph's genealogy, which is the way in which Matthew links Jesus back to King David, and thereby establishes Jesus' credentials to be the long-awaited Davidic Messiah. And that's a short discussion. There's much more to it. If people want to read the book, they can go through that with as much clarity as I was able to bring to it.
Basically, it's not that they view Jesus as one of the many sons of God from the classical polytheistic Jewish sense, but it was more like he was an amazing person they thought, and that's why they viewed him as a son of God. as you were just pointing out? Or do
Well,
you think it could be a mix of both?
I think it is a mix of both. I mean, for those with sort of Jewish instincts in their mind, Jewish logic, proclaiming him son means that he was not a lawbreaker. He was not violating Sabbath. He was not violating the commandments. He was not going against God. He was obedient to God fully. To those with a more Greco-Roman inclination, a lot of people were living in two cultures at once. So these things would bounce around together. They would say that a mere human could not have done what Jesus did, right? Because he could not have taught such amazing things. He could not have worked the miracles that he was reported to have worked. There had to be something divine about him. And they were well aware when they said that they were putting Jesus in a special category, but not unique. And we see this come up in the 2nd century when critics of Christianity, or very educated ones, begin to talk back and say, well, you said Jesus is God's son. Well, so is Augustus, so is Plato. What's the big deal? Right? And so there is this issue in that culture of how that plays out.
And how do you think Paul tried to wrestle with this? Paul was writing before the Gospels, before the Jewish war.
Paul shows no indication of having any knowledge of the stories about the virgin birth of Jesus. He writes, Paul is dead before the Gospels are written. He refers once to the birth of Jesus and simply says Jesus born of a woman. He refers to Jesus as descended from David according to the flesh, which means he has physical connection, right, to David, which would indicate that he believes that Jesus was, had a human father with a Davidic ancestry. That's not an issue for him. The whole idea of paternity understood that way. Now, the son thing about Jesus being a son is essential to Paul, and he's playing. Paul is a bicultural person, so he's able to draw upon both Jewish and Greco-Roman connotations of that word. The other thing to think about too is, of course, the Gospels, especially John's Gospel, doesn't call Jesus son. He says he is the son, right? So using that term as a way to elevate him among all the other people who might have some claim to be God's son. And yet it is this very same author, John, who insists that anybody who loves, God is love, anyone who loves is begotten by God, is a divine son. So it's, again, it's a term which hasn't yet settled into a specific one and only one meaning, which it will do later on as Christians debate in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Well, what do we mean by calling him son? And then we get the great councils and the idea about the Trinity and all of this stuff, which is quite foreign to the Gospels, but was crucial at that time in those later centuries to clarify all these ambiguities, which they had to clarify because the scriptures were ambiguous as to what these things meant.
Basically, the Gospel of John. Let me rephrase that. Do you think the Gospel of John, in a sense, kind of gives up on the matter by saying, instead of trying to wrestle with the phrase "Son of God," he's just going to say Jesus is the Father in John 10:30. Now I know that some scholars have different opinions on what John was saying there. If Jesus is the Father, somehow it's.
You mean the Father and I are one? And it
Yeah.
says that's, again, that can be understood perfectly in a Jewish context. It would mean I agree with the Father. He and I have the same will. I'm his son. He tells me what to do. I do it. I and the Father are one. It doesn't carry in my mind an ontological or philosophical or genetic claim about his nature. It's a statement about his perfect obedience. And John has no birth story. He just opens the gospel up like Mark does with Jesus as an adult. He has people refer to Joseph as Jesus' father without correcting them in any way. That's incorrect. So my hunch is that, again, I argue this in the book with some care, I think, that John assumes that Jesus came into the world the way everyone does, and that his spiritual status is not in any way connected to the genetics of his DNA.
Basically, John is trying to make out Jesus and God. He's not trying to say Jesus is God, but he's trying to say that Jesus and God have the same will, an identical objective.
Yeah, and it's the identity is so close in John, right? That he does give the impression, and I think willingly, that Jesus is divine in a way that other people are not. That his connection with God, he is the Son. He never explains how that is, but you can easily see how later centuries would think about this language where he says, I came into this world for this reason, meaning as implying that he had lived before this world and had come down. And you get all that bit about incarnation becoming so important. So John was the favorite gospel in the 3rd century of people who affirmed Jesus' full humanity and of people who affirmed his full divinity. And if John was unambiguous, those debates would never have happened. But it's fascinating how, when people want to argue, they can find a verse that backs them up, because the Gospels lend themselves to that kind of diversity of meaning. Gospels were written, there was no Vatican to oversee doctrinal uniformity at this time. If anything, the early Christian movement is characterized by a really wide diversity of very strongly held opinions about that.
I think right there is a perfect way of closing this discussion. Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Miller.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob.
Of course. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.